There's one theory that the Civil War accustomed people in Appalachia to using violence to settle personal grievances. There was 2 or 3 generations of extraordinary violence, extraordinary by both regional and national standards.
The war certainly left behind a climate of fear and mistrust, and people protected themselves as best they knew how.
There's a code in the mountains way down in the backwoods. There's a code in the mountains and an unwritten law. They're hairy.
Before the century turned, the most notorious family feud in American history would send images of violent, backward mountain men roaring across the newspaper headlines of America. The famous feud took place in the remote valley of the Tug River, which divided Kentucky from the newly formed state of West Virginia. On the West Virginia side of the river lived a family named Hatfield, across from a Kentucky family named McCoy.
The Hatfield-McCoy feud, that really wasn't a feud, it was simply a conflict. It had much more to do with the political and economic changes that were occurring in central Appalachia at that time than it had to do with the folk culture of the region or any of the traditional stories associated with it.
In the rest of America, industrialization was booming, and the hardwoods of the southern Appalachians were in great demand. Before large timber companies came into the Tug Valley, the wood was cut and marketed by local farmers, including the Hatfields and McCoys. The family patriarchs were Randolph McCoy, known as Old Randall, and Anderson Hatfield. Anderson Hatfield was a man born to star in his own drama. In the Civil War, he had led a group of Confederate guerrillas known as the Logan Wildcats. He was tall and imposing, with looks that earned him the nickname Devil Anse.
Devil Anse Hatfield was probably one of the most charismatic people, from what I can gather, that ever lived in this valley.
He was always described as, from childhood, as precocious. He did things like go out and get bear cubs and tame them and have them as domestic pets, and he was always known as the best shot in the valley.
Hatfield built the most successful timber business in the Tug Valley. McCoy was not as fortunate and bristled for years as his competitor thrived. Then in 1872, Devil Anse won a lawsuit over 5,000 acres of land that belonged to Randall's cousin, Perry Cline. McCoy was outraged and concluded that Hatfield was a thief, even though the land had been legally won.
Randall, I think, was like a lot of people in the valley who were losing out, whose economic prospects were declining, and that made him bitter and unhappy and trying to find someone to blame. And he blamed the Hatfields.
Cline and the McCoys vowed revenge for the lawsuit. Resentments grew over everything from property to politics. But the outright battles began at an Election Day celebration in 1882 with an attack on Devil Anse's younger brother, Ellison.
3 McCoy brothers got drunk and picked a fight with Ellison Hatfield. They stabbed him. He was a very powerful man. They stabbed him several times. It didn't do any good, so they shot him in the back. He lingered for 3 days.
Devil Anse said, well, if he dies, I'll kill the McCoy boys. And he kept him in a home over on the West Virginia side up in the hollow there. And they came to him and they said, he's dead. And then Devil Anse sent his people.
They caught them at daybreak way down in the backwoods. They caught them
they went over and they took the McCoy boys and they wrapped them around a pawpaw bush and they killed them.
They pleaded for mercy, but they heard not their plea.
In September of that year, the Kentucky court issued murder indictments for Devil Anse and 20 of his supporters. No arrests were actually made, and things calmed down for a while. But 5 years later, the feud exploded again.
So we have to wonder what happened in those 5 years. Well, what happened was the state of Kentucky discovered it had very rich coal resources in the Tug Valley, and it wanted to develop those resources.
The Norfolk and Western Railroad Company announced plans to run a line right through the Tug Valley. Suddenly, there were huge profits to be made in land, timber, and coal. McCoy's cousin, Perry Cline, was now a lawyer in Pikeville, Kentucky, and still furious over losing his land to Devil Anse. In 1887, he convinced the governor to enforce the old indictments against the Hatfields and to extradite them for trial in Kentucky. The politicians had joined the fray. This was warfare between Kentucky and West Virginia. The states were determined to protect their local families and hang on to valuable property. West Virginia refused to extradite. Taking matters into his own hands, Cline sent bounty hunters racing across the border. In response, a drunken Hatfield gang staged a vicious attack on a McCoy cabin.
They succeeded in burning down the house. They succeeded in killing 2 of Randall's adult children, and they beat up Aunt Sally McCoy, which was one of their worst mistakes because she was very much beloved.
I mean, coming down on those people in the middle of the night with kids inside and women and girls, and burn and kill.
This time, the Hatfields could not escape the law. 7 of them went to the Kentucky Penitentiary. But somebody had to pay more dearly for the bloody attack, and that was Ellison Mounts, a nephew of Devil Anse.
Poor Ellison Mounts, who was probably retarded, he was known as dim-witted or slow in the valley, ended up being the scapegoat, you might say.
In February 1890, Ellison Mounts went to the scaffold. The feud was over. It had lasted more than a decade and had left 12 people dead.
There are some people that say, well, who won the feud? No one won the feud. The McCoys lost the most. But the Hatfields will be the first to tell you we didn't win. We didn't win anything.
There's a code in the mountains way down in the backwoods. A code in the mountains and an unwritten law. There's a code in the mountains way down in the backwoods. Code in the mountains is the only law there.
The conflict between the Hatfields and the McCoys played right into the hands of investors from the Northeast and Upper Midwest, who were now streaming into Appalachia.
One of the things that the industrialists were very concerned with was violence.